The morning Petra Voss walked into the compliance office at Hargrove Capital Management, she had $43 in her checking account, a 7-year-old daughter with a winter coat 2 sizes too small, and a manila folder in her hands that she had been carrying around for 11 days like something radioactive. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had printed the documents at the library on Clement Street because her home printer had been out of ink since October and she had not replaced the cartridge. She had organized them in chronological order, paperclipped by category, the way she organized everything, not because anyone had taught her to, but because she was the kind of woman who brought order to things as a reflex, a habit grown from years of having very little margin for error. She was 31 years old. She had been a junior financial analyst at Hargrove Capital for 3 years, which meant she sat in a gray cubicle on the 7th floor and ran numbers through models that other people had built and flagged discrepancies that other people decided what to do about. She was good at it. Her supervisor, a woman named Constance Lee, had told her twice in writing that Petra had the sharpest eye for anomaly in the department. That was the word Constance used. Anomaly. Petra had thought about that word a great deal over the past 11 days. She had not gone looking for what she found. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, in the quiet of her own accounting. She had been running a routine reconciliation on the Meridian client portfolio, one of the firm's larger managed accounts, when the number that should not have been there appeared in column 14 of a spreadsheet that she had run perhaps 30 times before without incident. A transfer, small enough to be overlooked in a portfolio of that size, repeated across 46 separate transactions over 22 months. Not small at all when you added them up. $2. $3 million. Routed through a shell intermediary she had to spend 4 evenings tracing before she understood what she was looking at. Routed to an account registered to a holding company called Stellarbridge LLC. She had spent the remaining evenings, all of them after her daughter Mia was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad, building the chain. Stellarbridge led to Paragon Holdings, which led to an account in the Cayman Islands, which led through a corporate registration she found in a public database at 1 in the morning on a Tuesday to the personal holding company of Mitchell Hargrove, the 64-year-old founder and chief executive officer of Hargrove Capital Management. Her boss, the man whose name was on the building. She had sat with that piece of paper for a long time. She told no one, not because she did not know who to tell, but because she needed to be certain before she did anything irreversible. She went back through the data 4 more times over the following week, approaching it from different angles, hoping to find a path to an innocent explanation, an accounting treatment she had misread, a transaction category she had miscategorized. She found none. The pattern was deliberate, well-constructed, and designed to be invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it and who did not have the particular kind of mind that Petra Voss happened to have. She thought about her daughter. She thought about her rent, $1,400 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in the Richmond district of San Francisco that she paid on time every month with a precision born of the specific terror of what happens when you don't. She thought about her mother, Carol, who lived 40 minutes away in Daly City and watched Mia 3 days a week when Petra's hours ran long, and who had raised Petra alone on a teacher's salary and had told her once, when Petra was about 16, that doing the right thing was never as complicated as people made it sound. You already knew what the right thing was. You just had to decide whether you were going to do it. She decided. The compliance officer at Hargrove Capital was a man named David Wren, 40 years old, with a law degree from UC Davis and the practice neutrality of someone who had spent his career sitting in rooms where people told him difficult things. He listened to Petra's presentation without expression for 45 minutes. He reviewed the documents she had organized, asked 3 specific questions, and wrote down her answers. When she finished, he said he would need to involve outside counsel and that she should not discuss this with anyone. She said she understood. She walked back to her cubicle on the 7th floor and sat down and looked at her computer screen and felt the particular quality of a person who has dropped something from a great height and is now waiting to hear it land. She did not have to wait long. By the end of that day, the folder on her computer marked Meridian Reconciliation Q3 had been accessed remotely. She did not know this until later. She knew only that when she arrived the following morning, there was a voicemail from Human Resources asking her to come in at 10 o'clock. The HR director was a woman named Sandra Kwan, who had always been pleasant to Petra in the specific way of HR directors who are professionally warm and personally uninvested. She was not warm this morning. She was careful. She sat across a small conference table and explained that Hargrove Capital was undergoing an internal restructuring and that Petra's position had been identified as redundant. She would receive 8 weeks of severance. Her access had been deactivated as of this morning. A box of her personal items would be couriered to her home address. She said these things with the verbal precision of someone reading from a document she had been given and was not permitted to depart from. Petra sat across from her and felt something very cold move through her body from the top of her spine down. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She said, quietly and very clearly, that she had reported a compliance matter to David Wren 48 hours ago, and that this termination was in her view retaliatory in nature, and that she would be consulting an attorney. Sandra Kwan's expression did not change. She said she was not in a position to comment on any ongoing internal matter. She slid a severance agreement across the table. She indicated a line for Petra's signature. Petra did not sign. She stood up. She walked out. The cab ride home cost $18. She watched the number tick up and thought about the $43 in her account and the rent due on the 1st and the winter coat Mia needed and the grocery list she had been editing for 2 weeks to take out anything that was not essential, and she breathed very slowly through her nose the way she had taught herself to breathe in the years when steady breathing was the only resource she reliably had. She called her mother from the back of the cab. Her mother answered on the second ring. Petra said, without preamble, that she had lost her job. There was a short silence. Then her mother said, "Tell me everything." Petra told her everything. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Petra had always loved about her, the way she listened with her whole attention, without rushing toward a conclusion before you had finished arriving at one yourself. When Petra was done, her mother said, quietly and without drama, "You did the right thing. Whatever happens now, remember that you did the right thing." Petra looked out the cab window at the gray San Francisco morning and thought about Mitchell Hargrove, who had shaken her hand at the company Christmas party 2 years ago and asked about her daughter's name and said it was beautiful. She thought about the $2.3 million. She thought about $43 and a winter coat. "I know," she said, "but the right thing is going to need a lawyer." The attorney was named Raymond Chu, 53 years old, who had a small practice in the Tenderloin specializing in employment and whistleblower cases. He came recommended by a legal aid hotline Petra found at 11 o'clock that night after Mia was in bed. He had a voice like something worn smooth by years of use and an office with stacks of folders on every horizontal surface that were somehow organized in a way that only he could read. He reviewed her documentation for 2 hours. He asked for copies of everything. When he was done, he pushed his reading glasses up his nose and looked at her directly. "What you have here," he said, "is either a very significant Securities Exchange Commission whistleblower case or the most elaborate accounting coincidence I have seen in 30 years of practice." He paused. "It is not an accounting coincidence." He explained the SEC's whistleblower program. He explained the protections. He explained the timeline. He told her that if the underlying fraud was as she had documented it, the potential award to a qualifying whistleblower could be substantial, between 10 and 30% of sanctions exceeding $1 million. She would need to file before anyone else did. The retaliatory termination, well documented, strengthened her position considerably. He said all of this in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting observable conditions rather than making promises. She asked him what it would cost. He told her he would take the case on contingency. She walked out of his office into the cold San Francisco evening and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from a number she did not recognize. She did not call it back. She walked to the bus stop and waited and thought about the strangeness of a life in which doing the correct thing could cost you everything before it gave you anything back. And she thought about whether she would have done it differently if she had known. She would not have. That was the answer that came without having to search for it. She would not have done it differently. She went home. She made Mia's lunch for the next day. She sat at the kitchen table after her daughter was asleep and wrote down everything she remembered from the HR meeting. Every word. The way she had been taught to document things precisely, specifically, with dates and times and direct quotations where she had them. She went to bed at midnight. Her phone lit up at 6:40 the following morning with a number she had never seen before. She almost did not answer it. Something she could not have named made her pick up. Ms. Voss? The voice was a man's, older, careful with its syllables in the way of someone who chooses words like they are finite. My name is Gerald Okoro. I am calling from a law firm in Chicago, Coro, Whitman and Associates. I represent the estate of Arthur Voss. Petra sat up in bed. Arthur Voss, she repeated. The name sat in her mouth like something not quite real. Your father, Mr. Okoro said carefully. He passed away 12 days ago. I have been attempting to reach you. I understand you may not have expected this call, and I want to give you all the time you need. But there are matters of considerable significance that require your attention. Petra pressed her back against the headboard. The morning light was just beginning to come through the gap in the curtain. She could hear Mia shifting in the next room, the small sounds of a child beginning to wake. I never knew my father, she said. Her voice was steady. I was told he left when I was 2 years old. Mr. Okoro was quiet for a measured moment. What I am about to tell you, he said, is going to require some time to absorb. I would ask that you hear me through before responding. She said she would try. He told her. Arthur Voss, born in Chicago in 1951, had built a private equity and asset management firm called Was Capital Group over the course of 4 decades. The firm operated across 17 states with significant holdings in financial services, real estate, and technology infrastructure. He had been, at the time of his death, one of the most quietly influential figures in American private capital, influential in the specific way of men who prefer not to be written about and who have spent their careers arranging for that preference to be respected. He had never remarried. He had no other biological children. He had kept, Gerald Okoro said with the careful articulation of a man delivering a long-prepared statement, a careful and respectful distance from Petra's life for reasons that were documented in a letter that would be provided to her at their first in-person meeting. His instructions to his estate attorneys had been unambiguous and specific and had been updated as recently as 3 years ago. Petra was his sole heir. She asked, when she could, what the estate was worth. Gerald Okoro said, after another measured pause, that the consolidated valuation as of the most recent audit stood at approximately $61 billion. She put the phone down on the bed. She looked at the ceiling. She could hear Mia in the next room, awake now, calling out Mom in the particular tone she used when she needed something ordinary. A glass of water, help finding a sock. She picked the phone back up. I'm gonna need a moment, she said. Mr. Okoro said, of course. Take all the time you need. She set the phone face down on the mattress and sat very still for a long count of seconds. Outside the window, San Francisco was beginning its morning. A bus went past on the street below. A dog barked twice. The world continuing on in its ordinary fashion, entirely indifferent to what had just happened in a small apartment on the second floor of a building on Fulton Street. She thought about her mother, who had raised her on a teacher's salary and told her that doing the right thing was never as complicated as people made it sound. She thought about the manila folder now in Raymond Chu's office and the $2.3 million and the $43 still sitting in her account. She thought about Mitchell Hargrove, 64 years old, whose name was on the building, who had shaken her hand at the Christmas party and said her daughter's name was beautiful. She had not yet made the connection. It was still forming at the edge of her understanding, not quite arrived, circling like something that knows it will land but has not chosen its moment. It would arrive very soon. She got up. She went to Mia's room. Her daughter was sitting up in bed with her hair in about 7 different directions and an expression of patient inquiry. Mom, Mia said, can I have the cereal with the stars? Yes, Petra said. Her voice came out entirely normal. You can have the cereal with the stars. She went to the kitchen. She poured cereal. She stood at the counter while her daughter ate and thought about $61 billion and an old man she had never met who had watched her from a distance for 29 years and decided she was the only person he trusted to carry what he had built. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that the ground had changed beneath her feet, and that whatever came next was going to require her to be every inch of the woman her mother had spent a lifetime building. She was. Gerald Okoro flew to San Francisco the following morning with 2 colleagues and a briefcase that she was told contained the initial documentation and, in a plain white envelope set apart from the rest, a letter. She met them at a conference room at the downtown offices of a firm Okoro's team had arranged. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the bay on a morning when the fog had lifted and the water was flat and silver. She sat on one side of the table with Raymond Chu beside her. Okoro and his colleagues sat on the other side. The financial documents were staggering. She would think about them later when she was alone. The numbers, the scale, the architecture of what Arthur Voss had built over 4 decades of work. She looked at them with the focused attention she had always brought to spreadsheets and understood that she was going to need a great deal of time to understand the full shape of what she had inherited. She read the letter last. It was written in a hand that was small and slightly angular and had the quality of someone who had written in the same style for 50 years. Petra, it began. Not my daughter, not dear Petra. Just her name, bare and direct, as if the sentence before it had already been said, and she was being addressed mid-conversation. I have written this letter in many versions over many years, and I have thrown all of them away because they began with explanations, and I have decided you deserve something more honest than an explanation. So I will tell you only what is true. I left when you were 2 years old. I left because I was a man who had built something and was afraid, not of the people who wanted to take it from him, but of what it would do to the people standing closest to him if they tried. I had already made enemies by then, the kind that express their enmity through people who cannot defend themselves. Your mother was in danger. You were in danger. The only way I could end that danger was to remove myself completely and completely convincingly. I removed myself. I have never believed that this was noble. I believed it was the only option I had, and I have lived with the weight of it every day since. I want to be honest about something else. I could have reached you sooner than this. The specific danger passed years ago, and I did not reach you, not because I was afraid but because by then I was ashamed, and shame is a terrible reason to stay away from your own child, and I knew it was a terrible reason even while I was using it. I watched you from a distance. I watched you put yourself through school. I watched you become a mother. I watched you become someone who runs numbers on spreadsheets in the early morning because she has the kind of mind that cannot leave an anomaly alone. I was proud of that particular quality. I recognized it. I have it too. I know what you found at Hargrove Capital. I know because 3 months ago, an associate brought me a document that described precisely the pattern you uncovered, and I authorized a discreet investigation. I know everything you know and more. Mitchell Hargrove has been stealing from his clients for 11 years. Not just this account, 17 accounts, across 4 jurisdictions. The documentation is comprehensive and has been in the possession of the Securities and Exchange Commission for 6 weeks. You were not the first to file, but you will be well protected regardless, and Raymond Chu is going to serve you extremely well. There is one more thing I need to tell you about Mitchell Hargrove. I have thought for a long time about whether to put this in a letter or to let Gerald tell you in person, and I have decided that you deserve to read it in my handwriting, with whatever that is still worth, rather than have it arrive as a fact delivered across a conference table by someone who does not know what it means. Mitchell Hargrove is not a stranger to our family. He was my partner once, for a period of 11 years beginning in 1983 when we were both young men in Chicago building something we believed in. He was the one who first suggested routing client funds in ways that the documentation did not reflect. He was the one who, when I refused and told him I intended to report what I had seen, arranged for those threats I mentioned to reach the people I loved. Your mother. You. He drove me out of my own company and kept what I had built and spent 30 years building another version of it in another city under another name. He knew who you were when he hired you, Petra. He hired you because I was dying, and he knew the estate would find its way to you, and he wanted to know what you knew and control what you might find. He did not anticipate that you would find it first. You already know what the right thing is. You have always known that. I want you to know that I knew it too once when I was young enough to still be the person I wanted to be. I am sorry that I could not find my way back to that person while there was still time for it to matter between us. Everything I have is yours. I built it for you. I built it because I could not be your father in the ways that counted, and I needed to build something that could be your father, Arthur. She folded the letter along its original creases. She set it on the table. She looked out at the bay. The room was very quiet. Gerald Okoro and his colleagues were watching her with the careful stillness of people who have delivered heavy things before, and have learned that what is needed now is silence and not agenda. Raymond Chu put his hand briefly on the table near hers. Not touching, just present in the specific way that decent people are present when the moment does not call for words. She thought about Mitchell Hargrove shaking her hand at the Christmas party. She thought about him using her name, asking about Mia, saying the name was beautiful. She thought about the box of her personal items being couriered to her home address. She thought about sitting in that cab watching $18 tick up on a meter. She thought about the manila folder with the paper clips organized by category. She thought about her father, a man she had never met, who had spent 30 years watching her from a distance and building something he could not give her directly and leaving it all in a letter written in a hand that was small and angular and had recognized, from very far away, that she was the kind of woman whose mind could not leave an anomaly alone. She recognized it too. She had it too. He had said so. She picked up the letter. She held it against her chest. She sat with it for a long moment, and then she set it down and looked at Gerald Okoro and asked him, in the steady and specific voice of a woman beginning to understand the full shape of what she was about to carry, what happens next. He told her. They worked through the afternoon, through a lunch that someone ordered and she ate about half of, through the early part of the evening when the bay outside the window turned gold and then gray. The scope of Voss Capital Group assembled itself in her understanding piece by piece, not as a fantasy but as a structure, something real, something built, something with weight and dimension and 40 years of history embedded in its architecture. She asked good questions. Gerald Okoro, who had managed Arthur Voss's affairs for 19 years, answered them with the quality of attention that comes from someone who has been waiting a long time to find the right person to answer them to. She called her mother at 7:30 from the lobby of the building, standing near the revolving doors with the cold evening air coming through every time someone passed. "Mom," she said. Her mother answered in the voice of a woman who had been waiting all day for this call. "Tell me," her mother said. Petra told her. Not everything, not yet. There was too much for one phone call and her mother deserved to hear it properly, in person with time to absorb it. But she told her the shape of it. She told her about the letter. She told her about Mitchell Hargrove. There was a very long silence on the other end. Then her mother said, in a voice that had something strange and strained in it that Petra had almost never heard there before, "Petra, there are things about your father's leaving that I have never told you. Things I have needed to find the right moment for a very long time." Petra leaned against the cool glass of the lobby wall. "Tell me," she said, her own voice, reflecting her mother's back. Her mother told her. Arthur Voss had not left because he was careless or selfish or because Petra had not been enough of a reason to stay. He had left because someone had sent a photograph to their apartment and a handwritten note that described, in specific terms, what would happen to Carol and to Petra if Arthur did not disappear. Her mother had read that note. She had read it once and burned it and never mentioned it to Petra because Petra was 2 years old and then 7 and then 16 and then there was never a moment that felt like the right moment for a truth that complicated and that old. She had thought he was simply a coward in the early years after the anger settled. Then, as time passed, she had not been certain anymore what she thought. She had kept his name from Petra because it felt safer, because a man who was simply absent was easier to explain than a man whose absence was a wound with a history she could not fully narrate. "You should have told me," Petra said. "I know," her mother said. Her voice was very quiet. "I am sorry. I have been sorry for a long time." The lobby was filling and emptying around her, people coming and going with the ordinary purpose of an ordinary evening. None of them aware of what was happening in the conversation of the woman leaning against the glass near the revolving door. "I'm coming over," Petra said. "I need to see you." "I'll put the kettle on," her mother said. She went home first, picked up Mia from the neighbor's apartment, put her in the car still half asleep and soft with the particular warmth of a child who has been well looked after for an afternoon. She drove to Daly City. She sat at her mother's kitchen table, which she had sat at thousands of times in her life, under the same light fixture, with the same small crack in the tiles by the door that her mother had never gotten around to fixing, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about money. Not yet. About Arthur Voss, the man, who had been young and ambitious and frightened, and who had made a decision that had cost him his daughter, and had spent the remainder of his life accounting for it in the only currency he had left. Her mother cried, which was not something Petra saw often, and Petra held her hand across the table the way her mother had held hers through every difficulty of her life, And eventually the crying stopped and the tea got cold and Mia slept through all of it on the couch in the next room with the particular immunity of children to adult grief. "I want to show you something," Petra said. She took the letter out of her bag. She set it in front of her mother. Her mother read it slowly. She turned the page. She read the second half. She set it down with both hands flat on the table and looked at it for a very long time. "He watched over us," she said finally. "Yes," Petra said. "He knew about Mitchell Hargrove. He knew what Mitchell did to him." "Yes," Petra said. "And you found it. You found it yourself before any of this. Before the letter." "I found it," Petra said, "because I could not leave an anomaly alone. He said he recognized that. He said he had it too." Her mother pressed her fingers over her eyes for a moment. When she lowered her hands, her face had the look of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. She was not angry. Whatever anger there had been, it had had 3 decades to become something more complicated and more human than anger. What was left was grief and exhaustion, and beneath all of it, something that looked like relief. "It is real," her mother said. "It is all real. All of it," Petra said. They sat together in that kitchen for a while after that, not talking, just sitting. The house was quiet. Mia's small sleeping sounds came from the other room. The refrigerator hummed. The city outside made its ordinary noise. Petra thought about Mitchell Hargrove. She thought about him with a specificity and a clarity that she recognized as the beginning of something she was not yet ready to pursue. A process that would require patience and precision and exactly the kind of mind she had apparently inherited from a man she was only now beginning to know. She thought about the $61 billion. She thought about the infrastructure of a firm built across 17 states over 40 years, and what it would mean to inherit it and to understand it and to decide what it was for. She thought about $2.3 million routed through a shell company to a Cayman account by a man who had known exactly who she was when he hired her. She thought about the paper-clipped manila folder. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "You did the right thing." She knew that with the same certainty she had known it when she picked up the phone in the compliance office, with the folder in her hands and $43 in her account and a daughter who needed a winter coat. She had done the right thing and it had cost her her job and changed her life and brought her, via a sequence of events she could not have anticipated or engineered, to a kitchen table in Daly City where her daughter slept on the couch and her mother sat across from her with red eyes and a relieved face and a letter written by a dead man who had finally, at the end of everything, found a way to tell her the truth. She was going to need time to understand all of it. She knew that. She also knew that she was the kind of woman whose mind did not leave anomalies alone, and there was a very large anomaly sitting at the center of everything she had just inherited. A man named Mitchell Hargrove, 64 years old, who had stolen from her father and driven him out of his own life and then hired his daughter 30 years later as if the thing he had done had no consequences, as if the past had a statute of limitations that he had simply waited out. It did not. She was going to show him that. She just needed a little more time. She gave herself 1 week. Not to grieve exactly, though grief was present, a low and complicated thing that did not behave the way simpler grief behaved, that arrived in waves and retreated and arrived again with different cargo each time. She grieved the father she had not had. She grieved the version of her childhood that might have been different if Mitchell Hargrove had been a different kind of man. She grieved the years her mother had spent carrying a truth too heavy and too jagged to put down safely. But 1 week was what she allowed herself for the full weight of feeling, and then she got up from the table. She had a company to understand. Gerald Okoro had arranged for her to work from a temporary office in the San Francisco outpost of a law firm affiliated with the Voss estate, a clean, high-floored space in the financial district that looked out over the same bay she had watched from the conference room on the day the letter arrived. She went there every morning after dropping Mia at school, and she sat with the documents the way she had always sat with documents, with full attention, without impatience, building her understanding layer by layer the way you build anything that needs to last. Voss Capital Group was not a simple inheritance. It was a living structure, an organism with its own metabolism, its own dependencies and pressures and vulnerabilities. 40 years of her father's thinking were embedded in its architecture, and learning to read that thinking required her to hold 2 states at once. The analytical focus she brought to any financial problem, and something else, something more personal, the growing awareness that she was reading the mind of a man she had never spoken to. She found him in the work. That was the strange thing she had not expected. In the margin notes on acquisition documents from 1994, in the risk assessments he had written himself in the early years when the firm was small enough that he was doing everything, in the careful, angular handwriting that matched the letter. He had been precise and patient and structurally conservative in his investments and allergic to the kind of leverage that produced spectacular short-term returns at the cost of long-term integrity. He had built slowly. He had built to last. She recognized this, too. She had it, too. By the end of the first week, she understood the broad shape of the firm. By the end of the second, she had begun to understand its specific vulnerabilities, the relationships that needed attention, the holdings that needed review, the people within the organization who had been managing in the absence of a principal and who would need careful handling as the transition of leadership became real. She also began to understand what her father had meant when he said the documentation on Mitchell Hargrove was comprehensive. Gerald Okoro brought it to her on a Thursday morning in a separate briefcase from the estate documents, and she spent the rest of that day and most of the following one reading it. What Arthur Voss had assembled over the last 3 years of his life, through investigators and attorneys and former employees willing to speak on condition of confidentiality, was not a folder. It was a case. Detailed, chronological, cross-referenced, with the meticulous quality of a man who had waited 30 years to be believed and was not going to leave anything to interpretation. Mitchell Hargrove had been stealing from clients since 1997. Not just the accounts Petra had found. 17 accounts across 4 jurisdictions, as the letter had said, totaling when the full scope was calculated just over $48 million. Routed through a structure of shell companies and offshore accounts that had grown more sophisticated with each passing year as the amounts grew larger and the stakes grew higher. He had also, Arthur's investigators had documented, spent money over the past 18 months making certain kinds of arrangements that had nothing to do with client funds. A private intelligence firm, contracted through 2 intermediaries. Monitoring services applied to financial analysts at Hargrove Capital who had certain kinds of clearance within the Meridian portfolio. One name appeared repeatedly in the surveillance logs. Petra Voss. He had known she was getting close. She read this and felt something move through her that was not quite anger, though anger was part of it. It was more specific than anger. It was the feeling of understanding the full shape of something for the first time, the complete architecture of what had been done and what it had cost and what it had been intended to cost, and of deciding, with a clarity that had no room in it for doubt, that she was the person to answer for it. She called Raymond Chu. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he had been expecting the call. "Tell me where we are with the SEC filing," she said. He told her. The filing was progressing. The retaliatory termination was documented. Her position as a whistleblower was protected. The timeline he projected placed the formal investigation opening at approximately 6 to 8 weeks out. "What if we had additional documentation?" she said. "More than what we filed." "What kind of additional documentation?" Raymond asked. "The kind that demonstrates a 30-year pattern," she said, "not just the transactions I found. The kind with multiple accounts, multiple jurisdictions, and a surveillance operation targeting a financial analyst at the firm." Her voice was entirely level. "The kind that was assembled by a private investigative firm hired by the estate of Arthur Voss." There was a pause on Raymond's end that she recognized as the sound of a man recalculating. "Petra," he said, "who exactly was Arthur Voss?" She told him. The pause that followed was longer. "I need to meet with Gerald Okoro," Raymond said, "at the earliest possible opportunity." She arranged it for the following morning. The 3 of them sat in the financial district office with the bay behind them, and they spent 4 hours going through what Arthur's investigators had assembled alongside what Petra had documented and what the SEC had already received. Raymond and Gerald were both careful, specific men, and they worked through the material with the focused efficiency of people who understood exactly how much weight it carried. By early afternoon, Raymond sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a moment and then looked at Petra. "What you have here," he said, "is not a whistleblower case with supplemental evidence. What you have is a complete and actionable securities fraud case spanning 3 decades, combined with a documented pattern of retaliatory employment action, combined with a surveillance operation that your attorneys can argue constitutes criminal intimidation of a protected witness." He paused. "And you are the sole heir to a $61 billion private equity firm that Mitchell Hargrove spent 30 years trying to keep you from knowing about." Yes, Petra said. Raymond looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Raymond. Who else knows this? Raymond asked. You too, Petra said. My mother. And one other person I need to call this afternoon. She called Thomas Vega that evening from her apartment after Mia was in bed. Thomas Vega was 58 years old, a former assistant director at the SEC's enforcement division who had left government service 12 years ago to build a private regulatory consulting practice in Washington that was, by most accounts, the best of its kind in the country. Gerald had given her his name. Arthur's files had contained 2 references to him from 3 years back. He picked up on the third ring. She introduced herself. She said her father's name. She said she understood he had known Arthur Voss. A brief silence. Then Thomas Vega said, in the slow, deliberate voice of a man deciding something in real time, yes. He had known Arthur Voss. He had respected Arthur Voss. He had been told, when Arthur's health began to decline the previous year, to watch for a phone call from a woman named Petra. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she told him what she had. He listened for 37 minutes without interrupting, and when she was finished, he said, I have been waiting for this case for 11 years. Give me 48 hours. She said she understood. She went to her daughter's room after the call. Mia was deeply asleep, dark hair spread across the pillow, one arm thrown out over the edge of the mattress in the boneless way of children who sleep without reservation. Petra pulled the blanket up and stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about her father writing in the margin of an acquisition document in 1994, 17 years before Mia was born, not knowing that his daughter was growing up 45 minutes away and putting herself through college on scholarships and deciding to become a woman who ran numbers through models because her mind could not leave an Anomaly alone. She thought about the coat she had finally bought Mia last week, the right size this time, red with yellow buttons, and the expression on Mia's face when she had put it on. She thought about $43. She went to bed. The 48 hours passed. Thomas Vega called back and told her that the documentation was sufficient to support a formal referral to the SEC's enforcement division supplementing the existing filing, that he had contacts there who would understand immediately what they were looking at, and that the timeline, given the scope and the quality of the evidence, would likely compress significantly from Raymond's original estimate. He also told her something else. Hargrove Capital Management had 3 institutional clients accounting for approximately 60% of the firm's revenue. All 3 were large pension funds. 2 of them held investments in funds managed by subsidiaries of Voss Capital Group. The institutional relationship managers at those funds had, in the ordinary course of their work, periodic contact with the leadership at Voss Capital. Gerald, as a state executor, had been maintaining those relationships through the transition period. A phone call to the right person at the right fund, Thomas Vega said, making clear that the incoming principal of Voss Capital had concerns about the governance and compliance practices at a firm in which the fund also had client relationships, would be entirely appropriate, entirely legal, and would result in those clients commissioning their own independent reviews of Hargrove Capital's practices within a matter of weeks. He said this in the measured voice of a man describing a technical procedure, not a strategic attack. Petra thought about it for a count of 10 seconds. Make the calls, she said. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She was also building something else during those weeks, something quieter than the legal and regulatory machinery that was beginning to turn, something that took more time and more care and that she thought about in the evenings when the work was done and the apartment was quiet. She was learning who her father had been. Not from documents. Documents gave her the architect, the analyst, the builder. She was learning the man from the people who had known him. Gerald had introduced her, carefully and with appropriate discretion, to 3 individuals who had been close to Arthur Voss across different periods of his life. A woman named Ruth Pemberton, who had been his executive assistant for 22 years and who met Petra for lunch on a Tuesday in the financial district and spent 2 hours describing a man who was scrupulously honest with his employees, who remembered people's children's names and the dates of their illnesses and who sent handwritten notes when things went wrong for the people who worked for him. A man named Frank Castellano, who had been Arthur's college roommate at Northwestern, and who called Petra from his home in Evanston and talked for an hour in the unguarded way of someone who has been grieving and has found an unexpected outlet for it. And a woman named Helen Park, who had been Arthur's therapist for the last 8 years of his life, and who met Petra not to share anything confidential but simply to say, in the careful way of someone who has thought a long time about what she is permitted to offer, that Arthur Voss had spoken about Petra often, that the work of his final years had been significantly shaped by the hope that she would eventually know the truth, that he had described her, without ever having met her as an adult, with a specificity and an accuracy that had, when Helen Park later reviewed her notes after Petra's first public appearance as the incoming principal of Voss Capital, surprised even her. He knew you, Helen Park said simply. Somehow, at a distance, he knew who you were. Petra drove home from that meeting through the late afternoon traffic on 101 and thought about the specific quality of being known by someone you have never met. About the strangeness of inheritance, not money, but character. The way certain things pass through generations without instruction, without contact, through nothing more explicable than the fact of blood. She thought about the way she organized folders with paper clips by category. She thought about the margin notes in Arthur's acquisition documents from 1994. She thought, for the first time in this process, without the specific pain of absence at the center of the thought, about her father. She did not let herself stay there long. There was too much else to do. But she let herself have it, that moment, that quiet acknowledgement that something had been lost that might under other circumstances have been hers, and that the loss was real, and that she was permitted to feel it even in the middle of everything else. Then she put it away carefully and went back to work. Mitchell Hargrove noticed something in the fourth week. She knew this because Thomas Vega told her, carefully and without specific attribution, that certain communications had been intercepted in the course of the SEC's preliminary review that suggested the principal of Hargrove Capital was aware of increased regulatory attention. He had made calls to attorneys. He had made calls to 2 of the institutional clients. He had been told by those clients, in language that was polite and uninformative, that they had commissioned independent compliance reviews and would be in touch. He was beginning to understand that something was happening. What he did not yet know was the shape of it. He knew about the SEC filing that was not secret, and the retaliatory termination made it more visible than he would have liked. He did not yet know about Arthur Voss. He did not yet know about the estate. He did not yet know that the woman he had hired because he thought she would be controllable had walked into a compliance office with a paper-clipped folder and had set in motion something that had been waiting 30 years to happen. He would know soon. Petra had chosen to understand what she was inheriting before she stepped into the public role that the inheritance required. Gerald had advised this and Raymond had agreed, and she had agreed with both of them, not because she was afraid but because she had inherited her father's understanding that the quality of a structure depended entirely on the quality of the foundation, and she was not going to build anything on a foundation she had not personally verified. By the end of the 5th week, she understood the foundation. Voss Capital Group's board of directors was informed of the transition of ownership and leadership in a private meeting that Gerald facilitated in Chicago, in the firm's original offices, a room Petra walked into for the first time and recognized, in the way she had been recognizing things throughout this process, as a room she was supposed to be in. 11 board members. 7 of them had known Arthur personally. The other 4 had joined the firm in the last decade. She presented for 50 minutes. She answered questions for another hour. At the end of the session, the board chair, a man named Warren Kessler who had been with the firm for 28 years, looked at her for a long moment across the table and said, "You sound like your father." She said, "I have been told I think like him." He said, "He told us you would. He said we would know it when we met you. He told me," she said. Warren Kessler nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Many times." She flew back to San Francisco that night and picked up Mia from her mother's house. Her mother made dinner, the 3 of them around the small kitchen table in Daly City, and the evening was so ordinary and so warm that it sat in Petra's chest alongside everything else that was happening as a kind of anchor, the proof that some things did not change and did not need to. She told her mother about the board meeting. She told her what Warren Kessler had said. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then said quietly and to no one in particular, "He was right about you. Whatever else he was right about you." Mia, who had been listening with the selective attention of a 7-year-old who understands more than adults give her credit for, said, "Mom, are we rich now?" Petra and her mother looked at each other. "We have enough," Petra said to her daughter. "We have more than enough." Mia considered this. Then she said, "Can I get the cereal with the stars more often?" Yes, Petra said. Yes, you can. The morning that Mitchell Hargrove learned the name Was Capital Group in connection with his situation arrived on a Tuesday 6 weeks after Petra had first met with Gerald Okoro. She was not present for it, but she was told about it by Thomas Vega, who had it from a contact at the SEC, who had been in the room when the Enforcement Division made their first formal contact with Hargrove Capital's legal counsel. The conversation had gone, in outline, as follows. The Enforcement Division's contact had informed Hargrove Capital's lead attorney that the SEC was proceeding with a formal investigation into the firm's client account management practices, based on a whistleblower filing supplemented by additional documentation from a separate source. The attorney had asked, as a matter of form, for the name of the supplemental source. The contact had said, after a careful pause, Was Capital Group. There had been a silence on the attorney's end of the call. Then the attorney had said, "Excuse me, which Was Capital Group?" "The one in Chicago," the contact had said. "The firm founded by Arthur Voss in 1983. Another silence. Longer. Then the attorney had said that he needed to consult with his client and would be in touch. Thomas Vega relayed this to Petra with the professional neutrality of a man who had been in regulatory work for 30 years and did not express satisfaction in the conduct of his business. Petra said, "Thank you." She said it with equal neutrality. Then she hung up and sat very still in the financial district office for a moment. She thought about Mitchell Hargrove in the moment the name arrived. She thought about the specific quality of understanding, after a long time of believing something was safely buried, that it was not buried at all, that it had been growing in a different direction from the one you had thought, and that the thing you built on top of it was now entirely above the surface and standing in the light. She thought about her father being driven out of a firm he had built. She thought about a photograph arriving at an apartment in Chicago and a handwritten note. She thought about a man choosing to make himself absent from his own daughter's life because someone had decided that his daughter was a useful tool for a threat. She thought about Hargrove shaking her hand at the Christmas party and saying her daughter's name was beautiful. She felt the anger then clean and specific and entirely useful. Not the hot, consuming kind that leads people to improvise. The cold kind. The kind that sits in your chest and says, "I know exactly what I am doing and I am going to do all of it." She had one thing left to arrange before the formal process took over. She had thought carefully about whether it was necessary. She had concluded that it was not for her. She did not need it for herself. She had the letter and the board meeting and the bay outside the window and Mia's red coat with the yellow buttons, and she was going to be all right regardless, but because there were people who needed to understand what had happened to them. 17 sets of clients whose money had been stolen. Former employees of Hargrove Capital who had been navigating a compliance environment deliberately designed to keep them from seeing what Petra had seen. People who deserved to know that what they had suspected or sensed or been too afraid to name had been real. The truth belonged to them. She also thought about a younger version of herself, sitting in a cubicle on the 7th floor with a discrepancy in column 14 and a choice about what to do with it. She thought about how alone that woman had felt, how much it had cost her to pick up that folder and walk to the compliance office, how she had done it anyway because her mother had told her when she was 16 that doing the right thing was never as complicated as people made it sound. She wanted that younger version of herself and every version of that woman in every company where someone with power was doing something they had decided could not be found to know that finding it and reporting it was not the end of a career. That the right thing sometimes was the beginning of something else entirely. She arranged the event for a Thursday morning. Not at Hargrove Capital's offices. She chose a conference center in the financial district, a venue large enough, one floor below the space where she had first met Gerald Okoro and first held her father's letter. The guest list was specific and carefully compiled. Representatives from each of the 17 affected client accounts. Senior attorneys from both the SEC and the Department of Justice, who had by then formally opened their own inquiry in parallel. The investigative reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle who had been covering securities fraud in the Bay Area financial sector for 8 years, and who had received a carefully organized package of non-confidential documentation 3 days prior. Raymond Chu, Thomas Vega, Gerald Okoro, and 8 former employees of Hargrove Capital, all of them people who had raised concerns internally at various points over the preceding decade and had been managed out of the firm, reassigned, or told that what they had observed was a misunderstanding. She had reached each of them personally, through intermediaries initially and then directly, because she understood that people who had been told their perception was wrong needed to hear from an actual human being, not a law firm, that their perception had been correct. She had spoken to each of them on the phone. She had listened to what they described. She had said, in each case, in the steady and specific way that she said things, that what they had seen was real, that they had not been wrong, and that she wanted them to be present when the record was set straight. Every one of them had said yes. The morning of the event, she dressed in a dark navy suit that she had bought specifically for this occasion. Not because she needed armor, but because she understood that what she wore would be the first thing the room saw before she spoke, and she wanted the first thing to say, "I know exactly what I am doing and I have been preparing for a long time." She drove to the venue. She parked. She sat in the car for exactly 1 minute. She thought about column 14. She thought about the paper clips. She thought about $43 and an HR director with a severance agreement and a box being couriered to her home address. She thought about a man in Chicago who had watched her from a distance for 29 years and left her everything in a letter written in handwriting she had recognized before she understood why. She got out of the car. She walked into the building. The conference room was full when she entered. 70-something people arranged around a large rectangular table and in chairs along the walls, the specific density of a room where everyone present understands that what is about to happen is significant and has dressed accordingly. She took her place at the podium. She looked at the faces. The SEC attorneys, measured and specific. The DOJ representative with a notepad open and a pen in hand. The Chronicle reporter with a recorder and the focused expression of someone who had been waiting for a story for a long time. Raymond Chu, who gave her a single small nod. Thomas Vega, who gave her nothing at all and did not need to. She looked at the 8 former employees of Hargrove Capital arranged along the right side of the room. Some of them she had spoken to only once, briefly, by phone. Some of them she had spoken to 3 or 4 times. She knew their names and what they had found and what it had cost them to say so. She held each of their faces for a moment before she began. "My name is Petra Voss," she said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. 3 months ago, I was a junior financial analyst at Hargrove Capital Management. I was terminated 2 days after filing a compliance report documenting 22 months of fraudulent transactions in the Meridian client portfolio. She paused. That termination was retaliatory. It was also, I have come to understand, the latest in a pattern of conduct at Hargrove Capital that began long before I joined the firm and that has been deliberately concealed from the clients and regulators it affected. She connected her laptop. The presentation populated the screen behind her. Gerald's team had helped prepare it, clean and clear, chronological, specific. What you are about to see is that full pattern. Not as I found it, the portion I found is a small part of a much larger structure. This is the complete record, assembled over 3 years of investigation by people who understood exactly what they were looking at because they had seen it before. She advanced to the first slide. It began in 1989. She told the whole story. Not quickly. She took the time it required because the people in that room had a right to understand not just the transactions but the system that had produced them, the decisions that had been made, the specific and deliberate choices of a man who had decided that what belonged to other people was available to him if he was careful enough about how he took it. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. When she reached the section on the retaliatory termination, she described it in the same flat, specific voice she had used for everything else. The voicemail from HR. The severance agreement. The box couriered to her home address. She described it without drama because it did not need drama. The facts carried everything that drama would have added and more. When she reached the section on the 8 individuals seated along the right side of the room, she set down the remote and looked at them directly. These 8 people, she said, tried to tell someone what they knew. They used the proper channels. They followed the correct procedures. They reported what they had found to people who were supposed to receive those reports and act on them honestly. Instead, they were managed out, reassigned, or told they had misread the situation. She paused. They had not misread anything. Every concern they raised was accurate. Every anomaly they flagged was real. The record confirms this, and the record is now before the relevant authorities. She looked at each of them again, individually, the way she had on the phone. I want you to hear that from me directly and in this room, she said. You were right. You were not wrong about what you saw. And what happened to you after you reported it was wrong. The documentation of each of your cases is included in the package before the SEC and DOJ representatives in this room. The silence that followed was the specific quality of a room absorbing something it did not expect to absorb. She let it sit. Then she looked back at the table. One name has been notably absent from this morning's proceedings, she said. Mitchell Hargrove was invited to attend. He declined, through counsel citing ongoing legal advice. She allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite satisfaction but occupied the same general territory. He will have other opportunities to respond, she said. I expect he will take them. That is the appropriate and lawful process and I support it entirely. What I am here to do this morning is to ensure that the people who were affected by what he did have access to the full and documented record before that process is managed or shaped in ways that serve any interest other than the truth. She closed her laptop. That is the truth, she said. All of it that I have. It belongs to you. She stepped away from the podium. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then the Chronicle reporter's hand went up. Then for more hands. Raymond Chu was already on his phone. Thomas Vega was speaking quietly to the DOJ representative. Gerald Okoro stood near the back of the room with his hands folded and the expression of a man who had been waiting a very long time for a morning exactly like this one. She answered every question. She took 45 more minutes. She answered with the same measured, specific voice she had used for everything, because the questions deserved the same quality of attention as the statement. When the last question was asked and answered, she gathered her materials, shook the hands that were offered, spoke briefly with each of the 8 former employees briefly, because there was more to say than this morning could hold, and she had already told each of them privately that she intended to find the right way to address what they had lost, and she meant it, and then she walked to the elevator. She rode it down to the lobby alone. She stepped out into the San Francisco afternoon, which was clear and warm for the first time in what felt like weeks. The particular bright California clarity that arrives occasionally in November and feels like a gift rather than a forecast. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She thought about her father standing in front of a building in Chicago in 1983 with an idea and a partner he had trusted. She thought about the letter in a plain white envelope written in a hand she had recognized before she understood why. She thought about Mitchell Hargrove, who was somewhere in this city right now, in a building with his name on it, having a conversation with his attorneys about consequences he had believed for 30 years he had successfully prevented. She thought about column 14. She thought about her daughter in a red coat with yellow buttons eating cereal with the stars in it and her mother at a kitchen table in Daly City saying, "Baby, you did the right thing." She knew that now with a completeness she had not had on the morning she walked into the compliance office. Then, she had known it in her chest but not in her bones. Now she knew it in both places. There was a difference. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the first ring. How did it go? Her mother said. Petra thought about the room, the faces, the Chronicle reporter, the 8 people along the right side of the wall. It went, she said, exactly the way it was supposed to. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry but lived in the space between them. The sound of a woman releasing something she had been holding for a very long time. He would have been there, her mother said. If he could have been. He would have been in that room. I know, Petra said. She held the phone and looked out at the bay, flat and silver in the afternoon light. The same bay she had watched from the conference room window on the morning Gerald Okoro had arrived with a briefcase and a plain white envelope and everything had changed. She was not the same woman who had sat in that room. She understood that. She had not become a different woman, she was entirely still herself. Still precise and patient and constitutionally incapable of leaving an anomaly alone, but she was herself with more ground beneath her than she had ever stood on before. More history, more weight, more responsibility. She was going to carry it the way her father had built things and the way her mother had raised her carefully, honestly, for the long term, for something larger than herself. She put her phone in her pocket and started walking. She had a company to run. The Chronicle story ran the following morning. It was not a small story. It occupied the top of the business section with a headline that was factual and unambiguous and that contained, near the end of its second paragraph, the name Voss Capital Group alongside the name Hargrove Capital Management in a sentence that made the relationship between the two firms and the 30-year history behind that relationship entirely clear to anyone reading it. By 9 in the morning, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By 11, it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal's online edition. By early afternoon, 3 national television networks had requested comment from Hargrove Capital's communications office, and the communications office had said, in the careful, non-committal language of an organization that has been told by its attorneys to say as little as possible for as long as possible, that the firm had no comment on ongoing regulatory matters. Petra read the Chronicle piece at her kitchen table with coffee, and with Mia eating breakfast across from her, entirely unaware of the story and interested only in the question of whether there were enough stars left in the bowl to constitute a second serving. There are, Petra said without looking up from the screen. Mia poured. The story was accurate. The reporter had been careful and specific in the way of someone who had spent 3 days reviewing documentation before writing a single sentence and who understood the weight of what she was handling. She had quoted the SEC filing. She had quoted the substance of the Thursday conference without attributing anything to sources she had been asked to protect. She had described the pattern of transactions across 17 client accounts with the kind of clarity that makes financial wrongdoing legible to a general audience, not simplified, but translated, which is a different and more respectful thing. She had also, in the final third of the piece, described Petra, not with flourish, with the same specificity she had applied to everything else. A junior financial analyst, the story said, who had flagged the anomaly in a routine reconciliation, organized her documentation with the methodical precision of someone who understood she would only get one chance to be believed, filed her report through the correct channels, and been terminated 2 days later. Who had then, the story noted, turned out to be the sole heir to the private equity firm whose founder had spent 3 years assembling a parallel case that the analyst did not know existed until after her termination. The reporter had written, near the end of her account of Petra, she did not go looking for either discovery. She found both because she was paying attention. Petra read that sentence twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table and drank her coffee. She was not prepared, over the days that followed, for the volume of what arrived. Messages from people she did not know, forwarded through the firm's newly established communications infrastructure because her personal contact information had not been made public and she had been deliberate about that. Former financial analysts from other firms describing situations that rhymed with what she had experienced at Hargrove Capital. Women who had been told that what they had found in spreadsheets and compliance reports and audit trails was a misunderstanding. People who had signed non-disclosure agreements under the pressure of a termination and had spent years sitting with the knowledge of what they had been silenced about. She could not respond to all of them personally. She wanted to. She understood with a clarity that was becoming a kind of ongoing orientation that what she was doing with the resources she had inherited was not separate from these people and their situations. It was for them. It was because of them. It was in some way an answer to every version of the letter they had never had anyone send them. She worked with her communications team to respond to what could be responded to. She spoke personally to 3 individuals whose situations Raymond Chu identified as both serious and actionable. She authorized a grant, the first of what she intended to be a sustained funding commitment, to a San Francisco legal nonprofit specializing in employment retaliation cases, specifically for financial sector whistleblowers. She did these things in the margins of the larger work, the ongoing work of learning to lead a $61 billion firm that had spent 5 months without its principal and that needed, above everything, a steady hand at the center of it. She was steady. She had always been steady. That had not changed. What had changed was the scale at which the steadiness was required. Mitchell Hargrove surrendered his passport on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the Chronicle story ran, as a condition of the terms negotiated between his attorneys and the DOJ in advance of his formal indictment. The indictment was unsealed the following day. 43 counts. Securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. The surveillance operation targeting Petra had been documented thoroughly enough to support that count independently of everything else. He was 64 years old and he walked into the federal courthouse in San Francisco on a gray November morning in a suit that fit him very well, because he was the kind of man who had spent his entire adult life understanding that what you presented to a room was a resource, and he was not going to surrender that resource even now. Petra was not there. She had considered it. She had decided against it, not from lack of interest but from a clear-eyed assessment of where her attention was most valuable. The courthouse steps were where a chapter ended. She was more interested in what she was building than in watching something be torn down. She was told about it by Raymond Chu, who called from outside the courthouse with the brisk, factual manner he used when delivering significant news and who said simply, "It is done." He was arraigned at 10:15. Plea is not guilty, which nobody expected otherwise at this stage. Trial date will be set in the next 60 days. Petra said, "Thank you, Raymond." She hung up and stood at the window of the financial district office and looked at the bay for a long moment. She thought about her father in a Chicago apartment in the 1980s, young and building something and watching a partner he had trusted make a decision that cost both of them everything. She thought about the photograph that had arrived, the note, the choice he had made in the worst moment he had been given. She thought about whether she was angry at Mitchell Hargrove. She examined the question honestly, the way she examined all questions, without rushing toward the answer she expected to find. What she found was not the clean, consuming anger she had anticipated. It was something quieter and more specific. It was the feeling of understanding the full cost of a choice made by one man, the ripple of it across decades, across a family, across the lives of 17 groups of clients and 8 employees, and one woman sitting in a cubicle on the 7th floor with a discrepancy in column 14, and of recognizing that the cost had been real and had been paid by people who had not chosen to pay it. That was not forgiveness. She was not there. She was not certain she would ever be there, and she had decided not to hold herself to any particular timeline for arriving. But it was something more functional than rage. It was the clear-eyed acknowledgement of what had happened and what it had meant, and the decision to build something from the accounting rather than spending the accounting on something destructive. She was her father's daughter. She had it too. She turned from the window and went back to work. The trial, when it came, lasted 6 weeks. Petra was not present for most of it. She was called as a witness on the 3rd day of the prosecution's case, and she testified for 4 hours in the specific, unhurried, paper-clipped way she had always approached the communication of documented information. She was not nervous. She answered every question directly and completely, and, when the defense attorney attempted on cross-examination to suggest that her financial interest in the outcome of the case, given her inheritance of Voss Capital Group, and its documented involvement in the regulatory referral compromised the neutrality of her original compliance filing, she looked at him with the steady, patient attention she reserved for people who were working very hard to make a true thing sound uncertain. She said, "I filed my compliance report on a Tuesday morning with $43 in my checking account and no knowledge of my father's identity or his estate. I filed it because what I found in column 14 of a reconciliation spreadsheet was wrong, and I was not able to sit with something that was wrong and do nothing about it." She paused. "The financial interest you are describing," she said, "arrived 2 days after I filed." In that order, the defense attorney moved on to his next question. She stepped down from the witness box and walked out of the courtroom and did not go back. Raymond attended the remainder of the proceedings and briefed her at the end of each day in the concise, organized manner she had come to rely on. The verdict arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March, 7 months after the morning Petra had walked into the compliance office with a paper-clipped folder and $43 to her name. Guilty on 39 of 43 counts. Raymond called her while she was in a board meeting. She stepped out to the corridor and he told her. She said, "Thank you, Raymond." She went back into the board meeting and completed the agenda item they had been discussing, a proposed expansion of the firm's renewable energy holdings, which was a good expansion and deserved her full attention regardless of what was happening in a courtroom across the city. The sentencing came 8 weeks later. 17 years. Mitchell Hargrove was 64 years old, and he looked, in the photographs that ran in the Chronicle the following morning, like a man encountering for the first time in his life a consequence he had not been able to manage his way around. Hargrove Capital Management was placed into receivership the week after the sentencing. Its assets, or what remained of them after the regulatory penalties and the client restitution orders, were distributed under court supervision. The building on Market Street that had borne Mitchell Hargrove's name had a new sign within 90 days. Petra walked past it once, not deliberately, on her way from a meeting to a lunch. She glanced at the new sign, which bore the name of a compliance consulting firm she did not recognize. She walked on. She did not slow down. The restitution process for the 17 defrauded client accounts was lengthy and procedurally complex in the way of all such processes. Petra's attorneys participated in it on behalf of Voss Capital Group's affiliated funds, which were among those owed restitution, and she made certain that the process was treated within her firm's involvement as a matter of obligation rather than leverage. The clients had been wronged. The money belonged to them. That was the whole of it. She called each of the 17 account managers personally when the restitution orders were confirmed. Not to say anything consequential. To say that she was glad the process had concluded, and that she was sorry it had taken as long as it had, and that if there was anything the firm could do going forward to earn their trust, she intended to earn it properly and not to ask for it in advance of having done so. Several of them were surprised to receive the call. Several of them said so. She said, "I was taught that when something is owed, you say it in person, not through a letter, not through a representative. In person or as close to it as the circumstances allow." She meant it. She had been taught exactly that, in a kitchen in Daly City, by a woman who had given her everything she needed to get through the hardest years of her life. The 8 former employees of Hargrove Capital who had been in the conference room on the Thursday morning received something more than acknowledgement. Petra's employment attorneys had spent 3 months reviewing each of their cases individually. 4 of them had grounds for wrongful termination suits that Raymond assessed as strong and actionable. She did not push them toward litigation. She had learned enough about the cost of being pushed toward something by other people's agendas to have a strong distaste for it, but she told each of them directly that the firm would provide documentation, legal support, and expert testimony in any action they chose to pursue without cost to them. 3 of them sued. All 3 settled, quickly and substantially, once the defendants understood the quality of the documentation they were facing. The 4th, a woman named Diane Okafor, a 46-year-old senior compliance analyst who had flagged an anomaly in the Meridian portfolio 4 years before Petra had, and been told she had misread the model and then been restructured out of the firm 3 months later, called Petra to say that she did not want to sue. She said she had spent 4 years wanting someone to simply acknowledge that she had been right and that what had happened to her afterward had been wrong. Petra said, "You were right. What happened to you afterward was wrong." The documented record confirms both of those things completely. Diane Okafor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That is all I needed." Petra said, "I know." After a pause, Diane said, "I have spent 4 years wondering if my judgment was broken. If I had imagined it." "You did not imagine it," Petra said. "Your judgment was not broken. You found exactly what was there to be found, and you reported it the way it was supposed to be reported, and the system that was supposed to receive that report had been compromised in a way that was not your failure. None of it was your failure." Another silence. "Thank you," Diane said. Petra held the phone and thought about sitting in a cubicle on the 7th floor with a discrepancy in column 14. About the weight of knowing something and not yet knowing what it was going to cost to say it. About the particular loneliness of being the person in the room whose mind cannot leave an anomaly alone. "You were not alone in that room," Petra said. "You were just the first one in it." She meant it as the most honest thing she knew how to offer. She thought about Diane Okafor for several days after that call. She thought about what it meant to spend 4 years doubting your own perception because someone with more institutional power than you had told you your perception was wrong. She thought about how many versions of that experience existed in how many industries, how many companies, how many rooms where the person who found the thing and said something about it was the one who paid for finding it. She convened a small working group from within Voss Capital Group's portfolio of financial services holdings to develop a model whistleblower protection framework, not a compliance checklist, not a box to check, but a genuine structural commitment to the idea that the person who finds the anomaly is an asset and not a liability, that the correct response to someone telling you something is wrong is to examine what they found and not the person who found it. She chaired the first meeting herself. She told the group about column 14. She told them about the paper clips and the library printer. She told them about the HR conference room and the severance agreement. She did not tell them about the inheritance because the inheritance was not the point. The point was that the woman in the cubicle had been right and had been punished for it, and that the framework they were building was about making sure that was never the only story available to that woman. The framework was adopted by 4 firms within the Voss Capital portfolio in the first year. Raymond Chu wrote an article about the process for a legal trade publication. Thomas Vega referenced it in testimony before a Senate subcommittee on financial sector oversight the following spring. Petra did not attend the Senate testimony. She sent Thomas a note that said, quietly and without ceremony, that her father would have been glad about this. Thomas sent back a single line. He knew you would get here. He just ran out of time to see it. She filed that note in the same drawer where she kept her father's letter. The drawer was getting fuller. That was all right. Some things were supposed to be kept. Voss Capital Group's transition to her leadership was not without difficulty. She had not expected it to be. There were board members who had known Arthur for decades and who looked at her, despite the evidence of her capability and the unambiguous clarity of her father's instructions, with the particular uncertainty that certain categories of men reserve for women who have arrived somewhere they had not anticipated finding a woman. There were senior managers who had been running pieces of the firm with effective autonomy during the transition period and who had to adjust to the experience of a principal who asked specific questions and read the answers. She navigated these things with the patience she had cultivated across 31 years of being a person who had to work harder than most for the basic right to be taken at her word. Not with anger and not with performance. With the consistent, unhurried quality of someone who has decided that competence, applied long enough and specifically enough, answers most questions more effectively than anything else. By the end of the first year, the uncertainty had largely settled. Not because she had demanded it settle, but because she had spent 12 months being exactly what the evidence said she was: precise, structurally conservative, honest in her assessments even when the honest assessment was uncomfortable, willing to say she did not know something and to go find out rather than pretend otherwise. Warren Kessler, the board chair who had told her she sounded like her father, pulled her aside after the year-end board meeting and said that Arthur had written a note to the board 4 months before his death. He had not shared it before now because he had been waiting to know whether the note was accurate. He handed it to her. It was a single paragraph in the angular handwriting she knew. She will be patient where I was sometimes not. She will be thorough in ways I learned too late to value. She has not had the luxury of believing that the systems around her were built for her benefit, and that specific experience will make her a better steward of what this firm is supposed to be for than I ever managed. Trust her judgment. She has earned it in conditions I was never tested in. She handed the note back to Warren. She did not trust her voice for a moment. He said he was right about all of it. I want you to know that is the board's assessment as well as mine. She said, thank you, Warren. That means a great deal. She went home that evening and made Mia's lunch for the next day and sat at the kitchen table after her daughter was asleep and looked at the familiar surface of the table where she had once built the chain from column 14 to Stellar Bridge to Paragon to a Cayman account and finally to the name Mitchell Hargrove. She thought about who she had been at that table. The $43. The winter coat. The grocery list edited down to essentials. The late evenings with the laptop and the legal pad and the growing knowledge of something she had not gone looking for and could not unfind. She thought about who she was now. She was still that woman. She was entirely still that woman. She had not been replaced by the inheritance or the title or the $61 billion or the office with the view of the bay. All of those things had arrived and she had absorbed them and integrated them and was carrying them forward. But the woman who had carried them was the same woman who had been in the cubicle on the 7th floor, the same woman who had sat in the back of a cab watching $18 tick up on a meter and breathed slowly through her nose. That woman was the one her father had watched from a distance for 29 years. That woman was the one he had built something for. That woman was the one who had done the right thing before she knew there was anything in the world to be gained from doing it. That was the thing she wanted Mia to understand. Not the $61 billion. Not the view from the office. Not the Chronicle story or the verdict or the sentencing or any of the architecture of consequence that had assembled itself around one Tuesday morning's decision. The Tuesday morning. The paper clips. The walk to the compliance office. She had a conversation with Mia about it on a Saturday afternoon, not with the formal intention of a lesson but in the natural, sideways way that important things get communicated between parents and children when both of them are occupied with something else. They were making dinner, the two of them, a project that Mia had insisted on, and that involved a recipe card covered in Mia's handwriting and a considerable amount of flour distributed across the counter and one surface of the floor. Mia was measuring something with a seriousness that Petra recognized and felt land somewhere deep in her chest. "Mom," Mia said without looking up, How did you know it was wrong? The thing at work? Petra thought about how to answer this honestly for a 7-year-old. She said, when you add up numbers and the answer is not right, you know it because the right answer has a shape. It fits the way it is supposed to fit. When something is wrong, it does not fit. Mia considered this. And then you told someone? And then I told someone, Petra said. Even though they were your boss? Even though, Petra said. Were you scared? Petra looked at her daughter's face, which was turned up toward her with the focused, open attention that Mia brought to questions she had been thinking about for a while before asking them. Yes, Petra said. I was scared. But you did it anyway. I did it anyway. Mia nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already half decided. Then she went back to her measuring. After a moment she said, I think I got the flour right. Petra looked at the bowl. The measurement appeared, by her professional estimation, to be approximately correct. I think you did too, she said. They made dinner together in the kitchen while the San Francisco evening settled outside the window, and if there was something in the ordinary warmth of that hour, the two of them at the counter, the smell of something good cooking, Mia's running commentary on the process and its various outcomes that felt like something her father might have imagined from a distance without quite being able to picture the specifics of. Petra allowed herself to feel that without looking away from it. She had been allowing herself more of that lately. The feeling of things without immediately organizing them or filing them or deciding what to do with them. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Lim who had an office in the Mission District and a quality of focused, non-directive attention that Petra had come to trust deeply, had suggested in their second session that one of the costs of spending most of your adult life in conditions that required constant vigilance was a certain difficulty with simply being inside a moment without assessing its implications. Petra had said she recognized that. Dr. Lim had said, the goal is not to stop assessing. The goal is to also be able to stop, to let the moment be what it is without it needing to become information. Petra had been practicing. She was not natural at it. She suspected she would never be entirely natural at it, that the particular quality of attention she had been born with and had honed through years of necessity was not something that went away, nor did she want it to go away, it was too much a part of who she was. But she was learning to set it down for an hour on a Saturday afternoon while she made dinner with her daughter. She was learning that some moments were for keeping, not for using. Her mother came to San Francisco for 3 weeks in the spring, staying in the guest room of the house Petra had bought in Coal Valley, not a mansion, not a statement, a house with a garden and good light and room enough for Mia to have the kind of childhood that involved running in and out through a back door with muddy shoes. Her mother walked through the house on the first day with the quiet, absorbing attention of a woman cataloging something she wants to remember in detail. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She stood in the garden and looked at the light coming through the trees. Petra stood beside her. Her mother said, without turning, your grandmother had a garden. Did I ever tell you that? You told me, Petra said. A little one. Behind the house on Halstead Street. Tomatoes and something else, I can never remember what. She was out there every morning. Petra looked at the garden. Your father would have liked this house, her mother said. He was never someone who wanted something large. He was always more interested in something that worked well. She said it without grief, or rather with grief that had softened over the years into something more livable, the particular quality of feeling that belongs to losses that have been fully mourned and not abandoned but carried in a different part of the chest than the place where active grieving lives. I know, Petra said. I have read enough of his work to know that. Her mother looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read and then was not. You are both in you, she said. You know that, don't you? Both of us. Petra held her mother's gaze. The spring light in the garden was warm and specific, and the trees were doing what trees in San Francisco do in April, which is to insist, against all meteorological evidence to the contrary, on a sustained and irrational optimism. I know, Petra said. Her mother put her arm around her, and they stood in the garden for a while. She had begun, by that spring, to understand the specific quality of what she had been given. Not just the firm or the money or the professional standing, though those were real and she was not going to pretend they were not. What she had been given was a context, a history, an account of where she came from that was fuller and more complicated and more human than the absence she had grown up with. She had been given a father even at the end, even incomplete, even in a letter, She had been given the specific knowledge that she had not been left because she was not enough. That the truth of her father's departure was a story about love that had been forced into a shape that looked like abandonment and that had cost everyone who loved it dearly. She could not undo the years. She was not naive enough to want to pretend that the letter canceled the absence or that the inheritance filled the specific shape of what had been missing. It did not. There were things she had needed as a child and as a young woman that she had not had, and those things left a mark the way all true absences do, and she was not going to minimize the mark by overdressing the resolution. But she was 31 years old, and she had a daughter and a company and a garden and a mother who spent 3 weeks in her guest room every spring and a father's handwriting on a note in a drawer and a working understanding of what her character was made of and where it had come from. She had enough. She had more than enough. She thought about this on the morning she walked into the new offices of Voss Capital Group's San Francisco operation, which she had opened in the summer of her first full year as CEO. Partly because the firm's West Coast holdings warranted a proper presence and partly because she had decided, with the same clear-eyed practicality she applied to all structural decisions, that she was not going to uproot Mia and her mother and the life they had built to move to Chicago. She was the principal. The firm would come to where she was. The offices were on the 14th floor of a building on Mission Street with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the bay. She had designed the space herself, working with an interior architect recommended by a board member, and the result was something that her father would have recognized: precise, functional, nothing unnecessary, very good light. On the wall of the main conference room, in a simple frame she had chosen herself, was a single sheet of paper. Not her father's letter, which was in the drawer where it belonged, private and kept. This was a photocopy of a page from an acquisition document dated March 1994. One of the pages she had first found in the archives during that initial week of learning what she had inherited. The margin note on that page, in the small angular handwriting she had come to know as well as her own, said, "The numbers are right when the structure is honest. If the structure is dishonest, the numbers will eventually say so. Build the structure first." She had framed it because she wanted everyone who sat in that room to understand what kind of company this was and what kind of thinking had built it and what kind of thinking was going to continue to build it. She wanted them to know they were working for something that had been constructed with integrity, not luck, not inherited ease, not the confident assumption that the rules were made for other categories of people. She wanted them to know they were working for a woman who had found a discrepancy in column 14, and had walked it down a hallway in a building where she had $43 to her name, and had set it on a desk and said, "This is wrong." And that everything that had come after was built on that morning. On that choice. On the specific and irreducible fact that she was not the kind of person who could leave an anomaly alone. She was not. She was her father's daughter. She had it too. But more than that, she was her mother's daughter. And her mother had taught her something that all the financial acumen and structural intelligence and inherited billions in the world had not and could not have taught her. That your character is the only currency that never loses its value. That doing the right thing is never as complicated as people make it sound. You already know what the right thing is. You just have to decide whether you are going to do it. Petra had decided. She had decided on a Tuesday morning with a paper-clipped folder and $43 and a 7-year-old who needed a winter coat. She had decided without knowing what was on the other side of the decision. She had decided because she was the kind of person who had been built, carefully and over a long time, by a woman who braided her daughter's hair every morning before school and paid attention to what the people around her actually needed and told the truth even when it was heavy. That was the inheritance that had mattered first. The $61 billion had come after. And it was real, and it was consequential, and she was going to use it for good. She was going to use it for exactly the purposes her father had described in his letter: to help people being crushed by people with more power than conscience, to build something that lasted, to make the structure honest so the numbers would say so. But it had come after. After the woman Carol had made. After the decision Carol's daughter had made in a building where no one was expecting anything of her except her silence. She stood at the window of the San Francisco office on a clear morning in November, 1 year and 2 months after Gerald Okoro's call, had arrived at 6:40 in the morning, while she was sitting up in a bed in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Richmond district, and she looked at the bay. The same bay, flat and silver in the morning light. She thought about column 14. She thought about the paper clips. She thought about Mia eating cereal with the stars in it and her mother in a kitchen in Daly City saying, "Baby, you did the right thing." She thought about her father watching from a distance for 29 years with the specific loneliness of someone who had decided that the people he loved were better off without him, and the specific wrong of that, and the specific love underneath it, and the way those two things could coexist without canceling each other out. She thought about Diane Okafor saying, "I just needed someone to tell me I was not wrong about what I saw." You were not wrong. She had not been wrong. None of them had been wrong. The anomaly was always real. The person who found it and said so was always doing the right thing, regardless of what it cost them, regardless of whether there was an inheritance on the other side of it or only a cab ride home and a meter ticking up and a deep breath through the nose. The right thing was the right thing independent of its consequences. That was the only version of that principle that meant anything. Her mother had told her so at 16 and she had believed it and she had tested it at 31 and found it to hold. She turned from the window. She had a 9 o'clock meeting and a board call at 11 and a conversation with the working group on the whistleblower framework at 2 o'clock. And she was going to be present for all of it, fully and specifically and with the quality of attention she brought to everything that deserved it, which was everything. She picked up her coffee. She went to the desk. She had a company to run. And a daughter to pick up at 3:15, because whatever else was on the calendar, 3:15 did not move. That was not a rule imposed from outside. That was a choice, made freely every single day, by a woman who understood better than most what it had cost her not to have been someone's 3:15. She was going to be Mia's. She had decided that on the same morning she had decided everything else. She had decided it before she knew about Arthur Voss or Voss Capital Group or $61 billion or any of it. She had decided it in a cubicle on the 7th floor of a building on Market Street, with a discrepancy in column 14 and a manila folder with the paper clips organized by category and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the woman her mother had made was not the kind of woman who sat with something wrong and did nothing. She was not. She had proven it. She would keep proving it. Every single day. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.